Hello, welcome to Bekaert's Government Contractors Podcast, where we discuss current government contracting trends, compliance matters, and best practices to guide federal contractors forward. My name is Poppe. I'm a managing director and help lead the government contract consulting team here at Bekaert. And with me today is Jeff Annessa, a senior manager on our team. And today, honestly, we are scheduling. We wanted to jump on and get this podcast out very quickly, just with the new administration taking over. Just over one full week in to the new administration. It is right now Tuesday, January 28th. And Jeff, there's just been so much activity when it comes to these executive orders and realignment of priorities from the last administration to the new administration that we wanted to jump on real quick and get some information out to contractors on what they can do if their programs, contracts, grants, awards, whatever, have been impacted by the just kind of reprioritization of the new administration. So Jeff, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks, Eric.
So, jumping, back to what I was mentioning, last week there was the executive order, the DEI executive order that for, any type of DEI program that was related to diversity, equity, and inclusion DEI programs within the federal government, from a grant, from a contract perspective, or federal employees, those were all pretty much communicated that those need to be terminated and ended work. As of yesterday, and this happened a little bit over the weekend too, there was the order that, for all grants for anything related to, foreign aid, non-governmental organizations, diversity, equity, inclusion, gender ideology, any Green New Deal initiatives, as well as some funding under the IRA and IIJA programs, that there is a stop work for at least 90-day review period, and that some of this work might get terminated as well. So, Jeff, you and I work with a lot of companies when they have stop works that come down, or they have terminations of grants or contracts, or they have, those terminations could be for convenience or T for D for default. And just there's a lot coming out of the administration right now. A lot of people are trying to get answers about their programs and their contracts. To slow this down for folks, let's just start with, if an organization receives a stop all work notification, what does that mean?
Yeah, I can definitely touch on the stop work orders, which is typically a first step, prior to a contract being terminated. I know we've heard a lot of news on both stop work orders being issued as well as termination notices. Typically, one of the first steps is a stop work order, and it sounds exactly like it's labeled. It means to stop all work, whether that's for your contract, your program, whatever it is that you're working on. So that stop work order should be specific. At times, it can be for a portion of a contract. It could be for a specific scope of work within that contract or program. So make sure you explicitly read what's in that stop work order. It should give you instructions and have some pretty standard language. One of the main things that we typically see in there is, take all reasonable steps to minimize cost or mitigate costs. You want to make sure, one of my, recommendations is to reach out to your contracting officer or program manager, whoever issued that stop work order, to get a determination of what exactly it means, just to make sure that, nothing's unclear. There's a lot that's coming out really fast right now. So not to say the government isn't going to make a mistake in things, but definitely always reach out to be in contact. So as I mentioned, it can be for any part of that contracted work. It could be for all of that contracted work. So that really could impact the steps that you take as a company to ensure that you're mitigating and minimizing any costs on that program or contract. If you're a prime contractor and have multiple subcontractors, it's also your responsibility to go ahead and relay that information down. And one of the big things that you have to do is you have to do it in a timely manner. So any lag that there might be, if you wait a couple weeks and costs are still incurring from a subcontractor standpoint, you as the prime could potentially be liable for that and without reimbursement from the government. So you want to make sure you're doing your due diligence and informing all of your subs and ensuring that they understand exactly what that stop work order means. So typically you would forward on the stop work order that you received on the prime contract to send that to your subs, but then also meet with them, have some conversations, make sure they understand exactly what's expected of them. So I'll talk on the stop work orders. They're typically good for a 90-day period. At that point, there's a couple things that can happen, and this is really just based on how things are going to transpire over the next 90 days, especially with the new administration. So either the stop work order could get canceled and lifted, and you would just go back to contract work, at which point you would probably have some standby costs, some other equitable adjustment type costs that we can talk on a little later. The contracting officer could also extend the stop work order for another 90-day period. And then what everyone kind of hates to hear is at that point, it could also turn into a contract termination, where the contracting officer has decided to terminate the contract or the program for convenience. So I know one of the big things that we always kind of recommend is just staying in constant communication with your CO. And I know, Eric, you've probably got a lot of experience reaching out with our clients, helping with the conversations with the contracting officer. So any advice you want to give on really just gaining an understanding of what to do at that point?
One of the bread and butter things that they need to do is, you need to understand your contract. You need to read your contract. What are those exact terms and conditions? And also from a grant standpoint too, because there could be some very specific, especially if you have like a partial stop work or T for C, and you might have a component that hits this type of program. I'm thinking of like if you have an overarching, let's just make up a fictitious contract, and you have a ton of different CLINs that it's all about doing training for the Army. I'm again making up an example, and one piece of that could touch DEI initiatives, but the rest is not. How do you identify what that is and what's in scope and what's not scope from that termination or stop work, and having that conversation, and then also knowing what type of contract, what are the clauses, having the changes clause, the stop work clauses that are applicable to your prescribed steps to seek some recovery, and knowing what that is. So like, for example, 52-249-2, that should be incorporated into the contract. What are those different clauses that might impact you? And then also what's the agency specific stuff that you need to know that typically, unless you really have read those terms and conditions and gotten pretty granular with it, that you understand, Jeff, I think, who to talk to and where you might need to go find supplemental information at an agency supplement area, or if you need to go to 2 CFR or go to other section of the CFR, or different grant manuals too, to really understand what is my road to potential cost recovery for some of this information. So from that standpoint, it does get it can get very confusing quickly. So leveraging and really leaning on your advisors too, your accountants that understand government contracting, legal counsel that understands government contracting, and what are those steps, because this could move pretty quickly. Now you hit, my ears perked up a little bit when you were talking about prime and subs and flowing things down pretty quickly. Can you just, I know you've had tons of conversations with actually I can think of one company in particular recently about dealing with a subcontractor, and they received a T for C, and just how it can kind of roll downhill. You want to talk about that a little bit and exactly what flows down?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll say things typically move pretty fast as far as responsibilities for a prime contractor as well as a subcontractor, even though the government in the termination for convenience process does not move fast. But I think you touched on one of the FAR sites, Eric, 52-249-2. So that's typically the general guidance for fixed price type contracts that are terminated. And there's several other sites in that 52-249. And one of those sites will most likely be listed in your prime contract termination notification. It'll basically tell you as a prime contractor to, go look up the site, understand what your responsibilities as a prime are, now that your contract has been terminated, and it does list out several steps on there. I'll touch on some of the key ones. One of them is flowing down the termination notice to your subcontractor in a timely manner and ensuring that your subcontractor understands, receives, and also follows the guidance. So that is your responsibility as the prime. There's a lot of different things in there. It touches on the stop work order to ensure that contractors understand they should stop all work. mitigate, minimize any costs for that contract at that point in time, that you should not be placing any other orders, any other subcontracts, anything else continuing on in that contract, unless there is some sort of a partial termination where there is some sort of scope that's continuing on. So that's why I think it's always important to meet with those contracting officers who issue that.
And I want to jump in on that, Jeff, because you have a lot of folks just from a practical standpoint, they work in the field, they're working on the contracts, and they're like, well, I just talked to, my point of contact at the program, and they said, no, you should continue working. Don't worry about this stop work. Then that's a huge no. If you receive word with this, formal stop work or termination notice, you go off that CO. You do not go off of anyone in the field because you could be liable for those costs. Sorry, when you said that, I just thought of, you always hear folks saying, oh, well, this person said verbally that we can keep working, so it should be okay. So let's just keep going to make the client happy. This is one of those situations that it's pencils down, it's walled off, you set up new codes and you stop work completely to mitigate those costs.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I'm glad you pointed that out as well. I mean, everything is what's in writing, what's been issued formally. I mean, you can't go by anything word of mouth or just approval, verbal approval. You're going to be liable for that in the end. So I definitely would not recommend that. Some of the other things that are in there, once you have been terminated yourself, you need to also terminate those subcontracts. So I know you've already told your subs that you're stopping work. You're notifying them of the termination. At that point, in order to mitigate and minimize costs. It's not super clear in the regs, but you should also, if you're a contractor that did any type of manufacturing, had any type of inventory, try to return any product to those subcontractors. Even if you know it's something that was specialized, something specifically designed for the scope of work that you were performing, even if you know that they're going to say, no way, we're not giving you anything back, we don't take refunds or anything like that, it's still your responsibility to try. And I would definitely make sure that you maintain documentation for that. If you're going to have that conversation over the phone, make sure you follow up with an email so that you have some sort of paper trail. We'll talk about the importance of documentation and just really how it can help you rather than hurt you. And it's definitely worth the effort on these terminations. One of the other things that you have to do, if you did have any type of inventory or material on the actual contract or project, that you have to submit an inventory schedule within 120 days within the receipt of that termination. So the effective date of your termination, within 120 days, you have to have this form filled out. It's not the easiest to read. It is a standard form that's out there on the government website. It's the SF 1428, SF standing for standard form. It's got some instructions, but they're not the best. But you do have to list out every single material or inventory item, a price for it, the condition that it's in, what it was for. So there's a good amount of work that's in this. One of the other main restrictions that's on here too, and this might seem like a lot of time, but contractors have 1 year to submit a termination settlement proposal to the government from the date of their termination. There are, circumstances where you can request an extension, but as a prime contractor, you also have to receive termination settlement proposals and termination settlement proposal forms from all of your subcontractors. And as a prime, you're responsible for reviewing, evaluating, and determining reasonableness, and also obtaining all of the supporting documentation to be able to make that determination from a reasonableness standpoint. So as I mentioned, if you can send any product back to any of those subs, definitely try to. If not, I'd say it's not very common, unless it's a common item and you have a sub that you work with. The government is also at that point going to look to see if it's a material inventory item, if you utilize those products on any of your other contracts, if it's a common use type item. So just expect to kind of go through the ringer on a lot of this. So I know one of the things I kind of touched on a little bit there, Eric, was really just talking about the importance of documentation. Can you kind of just walk through, like, where is it used? Why does it matter? How it can kind of help things throughout the process?
Yeah, no, it's, you mentioned those termination proposals within 1 year. And if you do have a stop work and then you actually get granted this, you get that green light again and start working again, you want to be able to track those costs because of the stop work, or you get terminated. In doing that, it's just like setting up a new project, and you should be setting up new project codes to be collecting the underlying costs and accounting data that you need to be able to support a cost proposal, a claim, and get that through any type of audit with the government. With that, these settlement proposals take a while to typically get resolved. and you go through an audit, and you need to have the underlying support and documentation to be able to show what those labor costs were for, from slowing down the work and stopping completely, or any costs that were associated from an overhead standpoint that you have to apply to that stop work. So you are trying to cover costs over multiple periods, over the contract period of performance. You want to make sure that your costs include comply with that stop work. So any standby or severance or any other termination type costs that might be included. You have costs that are related to the termination itself. So if you have to move equipment around, you have to, bring people back from overseas, you have any type of materials, et cetera. Costs that support the termination itself. And that could be settlement expenses as well, too. So accountants, legal, C-suite, trying to trying to make sure you have it all collected and included. And it's important to have all of those records as clean as possible to help support the audit, so you can get your money as quickly as possible, and maybe even get partial payment on the front end if you're able to negotiate that. The big way you also, with this documentation, you hit this a few times, but documenting how you are trying to control costs and mitigate costs. Documenting the conversations with the subs, documenting conversations with the government of trying to give back government property, or trying to close out and hand over deliverables, and making sure that you maintain that documentation for all steps taken to mitigate and minimize those costs. I think that's huge. It's just showing that you are trying to minimize the cost of the government as much as possible and make it as easy as possible for the auditor is why you want to set up new codes, have good underlying internal controls and processes that make sure that you can get through an audit and be audit ready for that. With that too, it's understanding the terminations and the types of terminations, which I know there's kind of a few flavors of that. Do you just want to hit on that real quick on, difference between fixed price, cost plus, what that means, because it can get pretty confusing especially in the fixed price piece.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's additional standard forms. I mentioned the inventory disposition form earlier, but there are standard forms that the government requires prime contractors and subcontractors to submit their termination settlement cost. They call it the termination settlement proposal. So there's two forms for fixed price contracts, which is the SF 14, 35 and 36, and then the SF 1437 for cost type. So on a cost type contract, it's just like you would think. You roll up all of your contract costs that were incurred in the performance of the contract, and then you include any other additional costs that you incurred to support the termination because of the termination. So anything in the stop work order, anything, as Eric mentioned, when you're pulling off of a site or overseas or coming out of production, anything that you had to do. And then there's other costs that you have, as Eric mentioned, settlement expenses, which are your specific expenses that you've incurred for, say, legal counsel, your administrative personnel, your accounting functions to be able to roll all of this up and work through all this. So any meetings you're having with the government after that termination notice, all of that goes on a form, basically rolls up all of the costs that you've incurred. You back out what you've been paid to date, and then you have your amount that's due. So it's somewhat straightforward on the cost type contracts. However, on a fixed price contract, it's a little muddier. So on the fixed price contracts, they have a section that's in there that you can fill out. So for anything, any finished product or service, depending on how your contract was, was scoped or scheduled with different CLINs, different milestones. So anything that has been fully delivered, developed, produced, signed off on, accepted by the government is not at risk. However, if you do have a firm fixed price contract and there's scope that was halfway performed, all of that is going to be rolled up on either an inventory basis or either on a cost basis, even though it's a firm fixed price contract. So the government is not necessarily going to reimburse you solely based on what you incurred against, where you're at on your firm fixed price contract at those firm fixed price contract amounts. Their sole intent of these terminations is just to make sure that contractors are made whole and don't incur any type of undue loss because of the termination. That doesn't mean if you had a firm fixed price contract where you were able to get a 30% profit, that on any remaining work that hasn't been delivered, you're still going to get that 30% profit. So that's where it kind of gets a little muddy when you're trying to roll these costs up and work through these things. And I've worked on several of these with several different government agencies. I will tell you, a lot of government agencies handle them differently. Some of them are faster than others. Some of them are more knowledgeable than others. Most DoD contracts are going to be assigned to a DCMA, termination contracting officer or termination contracting specialist. Other agencies, it might be your PCO, it might be your main contracting officer that's working through it. It really just depends how they're going to handle that and what that agency is. I know with everything going on right now, there's several different agencies that we're hearing about where there's going to be stop work orders and terminations. So just kind of referencing, stay in touch with your COs on any of you that have received a stop work order or a termination notice.
Yeah, and to jump in, I think that's a good point to pivot to. You'll hear people talk about requests for equitable adjustments, claims, terminations. That's a good point to really pull in your advisors and your experts internally for your contracts and accounting team and legal, and then outside legal counsel and accountants, where you're talking through what is really the best approach. If it's a stop work, should you just be submitting a request for equitable adjustment, which is pretty much you putting together a cost volume to the government with a cover letter? There are definitely, under the changes clauses, a prescribed method to that you're submitting and saying, hey, to get whole, we're asking for this much. Is that really an option, or should it potentially really go to more of a claim and go through claims court? Or are we in a situation with terminations that you're going to go through a termination proposal and then claims? And that's where, it's really good to pull in those experts. And there are several steps that you can. So, let's say you're a company that you did receive the stop work order and you're getting ready. You're like, and you're set up the new codes. Jeff, what's your thoughts on, what are the steps that we can take to help minimize the settlement process timeline and maximize really the recovery and get as much as you back as you can during that settlement or negotiation? Like, do you have any thoughts there?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the biggest thing for me is documentation and due diligence. These terminations are a lengthy process. I'm just going to start right off with that. Especially the fact that I feel like we potentially have so many hitting at once right now, especially with specific agencies. They might slightly be flooded with some of these. I'll speak specifically to the DoD. I've got a lot of experience with DCAA. So I will tell you, in the FAR, any termination settlement proposal that's over $2 million requires audit. Within the DoD, that's going to be DCAA. I will tell you, even on a $2 million settlement, DCAA is typically taking 6 to 8 months to perform an audit. So that's once DCAA receives your termination settlement proposal, it's already been reviewed by a contracting officer, submitted and requested to them after you've probably taken a couple months to put it together and make sure you have all your costs in there. So you can kind of just see how lengthy this process can be. And then you still have to go and negotiate with the actual contracting officer on a lot of this. So some things that you can do to speed this up, both from a DCAA review standpoint, any other auditor review that might happen, or just the DCMA or some sort of terminating contracting officer review, is just have everything put together in a supportable package. If you're rolling up all of your contract costs, have all of your accounting records and documentation ready to go to support that. When we build these things, we regularly have everything referenced right back to those source documents. So it's easily able to be reviewed, easily able to be accepted. I know a lot of these that I've worked with the government on, before they will even accept receipt of a termination settlement proposal, a lot of times they want a draft walkthrough just to walk through it and ensure that all of these costs are supported back to your system and or third-party documentation like vendors. Things like timesheets, expense reports, invoices, all sorts of different things that they want to see to support these costs. So I think if you can make sure that you package all of that, as you mentioned, setting up different codes, just start setting up different, buckets to be able to put these costs in and trace them back to, so that you can easily demonstrate them and support them.
Well, and that's a good point. That's subs included. So making sure your subs have appropriate time to put together their packages for you then to include in yours. That they have the correct documents, but there's going to be probably a flood of these different settlement proposals going in all at the same time. So how do you kind of slowly chip away and get settled quicker? It's having all your ducks in a row from a packaging standpoint. And with that too, when we talk cost, it's not just the direct costs that we're identifying, the people that you're standing down, but, making sure that you have your indirect costs appropriately allocated and absorbed to those correct cost objectives. This is for contracts or grants, that you have the correct indirect rate structure, that you're recovering everything that you can to then use as part of that settlement process. So I just wanted to make sure we hit there. Like, this isn't just a direct standpoint of labor, materials, and subs. It's, you want to make sure you're allocating the appropriate amount of indirect to these as well too.
Yeah, I think the preparedness is a big thing. You're going to move faster through the process if you have everything aligned and ready to go, make things easier for the government to review, submit, and approve. It's just going to go much, much smoother in your favor, rather than the ones where you have to keep going back and forth with the government, back and forth and back and forth on these different areas before you even get to negotiations. I've seen this happen a lot of times, just trying to get a termination settlement proposal submitted. So you want to make sure you've got everything lined up for this.
Yep. And a lot of times it gets back to those underlying terms and conditions of your contract or your grant, understanding the agency's specific items there, any supplements, and having that documentation and everything together. So, Jeff, this is about all the time we had today. We wanted to get out something pretty quick, as this is, ever evolving with these new initiatives with the administration. Do you have any closing thoughts?
Yeah, just wish everyone the best as these stop work orders and T4Cs are coming out. We're definitely here to help anyone navigate through if you have any questions and things. I think we touched on a lot of the key points that, both prime and subcontractors should focus on if they're going through this process. But yeah, I just wish everyone the best.
Thank you. And that's all the time we have today. Again, if you guys have any questions, as Jeff mentioned, please feel free to reach out to us. We thank everyone for tuning in and listening. So please let us, follow us wherever you get your podcasts. And thank you very much.